Hi there. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today. For our session, we'll be going over our best practices for documenting your compliance policies and procedures. Before we get into things, I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Sean McKinley, and I'm the lead sales engineer here at IT Glue. I've been speaking about documentation for a few years now with IT Glue, and what I've found is that there's still a large subset of the IT industry that doesn't realize how important documentation is relative to your compliancy. So I've taken it upon myself to try and educate the space in that regard. Now, let's touch on today's agenda. First, we'll be talking about what exactly GRC is, what it stands for, and what it really means. We're going to talk about the importance of documentation as it relates to GRC, and we're going to talk about how IT Glue can help you get there. So let's jump right into it with a simple question. What is GRC? Well, first and foremost, does anyone in the audience know what GRC stands for? And you can go ahead and, toss your hand up or toss it in the chat if you have an opportunity. And I'm sure a lot of you do. But for those of you who don't know, it stands for governance, risk, and compliance. GRC is a comprehensive and integrated approach to managing risks and compliance. And you need a holistic view of your organization and its security and compliance practices in order to properly address its policies. Now, initially, you might be wondering what GRC has to do with documentation. What does it have to do with documenting policies and procedures, which is the reason why we're here today? Well, we're going to take a top down approach in this webinar, starting with overarching GRC knowledge. Then we're going to drill down into each area: governance, risk, and compliance. As we go, we'll talk about how policies and procedures are a critical part of your overall compliance strategy. First, let's talk about governance, and let's hear from the audience what they think governance is about. So, go ahead and type that in the chat what governance means to you. Now, to us, what governance is really about is planning, tracking, and measuring the risk and compliance activities you have at play. Without governance, organizations are only reacting to security issues or following instincts of IT and security professionals. Now, the question then becomes, how do you govern your risk and compliance initiatives? Well, first, we as a company have to understand governance. Governance is how the company looks at itself, how it governs itself. It's operational documents and practices that help the MSPs make decisions, corporate or financial, and those sorts of decisions could impact risks or take you out of compliance. So, governance is not a one and done activity. Actually, governance is the force that leads improvements into security and compliance posture. It should define your goals, plan activities, monitor results, and rinse and repeat from there. For that reason, your governance program should be reviewed periodically and aligned with the current corporate initiatives. You could use a typical ISO management system as a reference for your program, plan, do, check, act. And the plan, check, and act phases are all a part of that governance process. Translating that into operational activities for a moment. You can execute governance with a few different things like your policies. Policies are the documentation of the corporate direction and rules about what can and cannot be done within the organization by its employees, its contractors, and third parties. Policies need to be centrally and securely located. Corporate policies got to be accessible by everyone. And there should be change management for revisions or versions documented with a systematic way to review, document, enforce, and maintain these across your organization. Now, the rules are important, but sometimes exceptions are needed. For example, you might need to integrate with a legacy system that can't enforce password complexity the same way that your more current systems would be able to. So you need to consider your password policy. And if so, you need to be sure that you've made a note of this type of exception for this particular system. In general, all your policy exceptions must be documented, approved, and reviewed periodically. And we're going to discuss how to properly document and approve policies and exceptions later when we discuss compliance. Now, another piece to governance is your risk and the compliance itself. You wrote and approved your organization's policies. Now it's time to make sure that the rubber meets the road, as it were. And what I mean by that is the policies are actually implemented and actually being fully followed. Most likely, you'll need to implement or improve your security controls to be sure everything is operating as expected. And speaking on planning, you could use a regulation or standard to structure your planning. For example, if your organization is audited for SOC 2, you might want to create your plan using the SOC or COSO controls. we can take a look at how IT Glue can be used to assist with tracking those tasks associated with those security controls. Within IT Glue, we've got the ability to set up custom assets so that you have a centralized and effective place to document your security tasks, the steps necessary for the standards to be properly set in place, and due dates for when those tasks need to be accomplished. And you can also relate those tasks to the relevant documentation on how those tasks are going to be accomplished to further assist you with your governance and compliance requirements. And another piece to this is metrics. For good governance practices, you should be able to measure and monitor the security compliance activities and their effectiveness. For example, you need to know and ideally be alerted in advance when policies are about to expire so that you can start the review cycle. The same concept applies to your policy exceptions, which should be reviewed and ideally closed or extended before that expiration date hits. And we can't forget about auditing. Trust by verify is the auditing mantra. And the audit's goal is to assure that you have controls that are properly designed and effectively implemented. And we know evidence gathering is key, which is why we have ways with IT Glue that we can assist with your auditing as well. Once again, with custom assets that you can create inside of our system, we can centralize the location for all of your audits and the completion of your governance and compliance focused tasks. Now let's talk about risk. And what risk really is the potential change of plans. We're measuring uncertainty relative to our goals. And the biggest question about risk is how do we manage it? Well, when it comes to managing risk, you've got a few things that you have to keep in context, like the context or the scope of that risk. You have to be able to identify the risks themselves and know the threats and vulnerabilities therein. You have to be able to measure those risks and understand the level of exposure and potential impact to the business that those risks can cause. And when we talk about measuring risk, you have to think of it as a math equation. You can think of risk as risk equals the likelihood times the impact of that risk. And when we have that level of understanding, we can assign that risk as a qualitative risk or a quantitative risk. Qualitative risks being those risks that are low, medium, and high priority risks, and quantitative dealing with the business revenue that can be lost as a result of that risk. And from there, we can evaluate against the risk appetite of the business. And then we can prioritize treatment based on risk reduction and understand the level of investment needed for that treatment. From there, we can then remediate those risks and reduce them to an acceptable level. Now, inside of IT Glue, there are a few ways we can assist with that. We have the ability to set up a bunch of different customized assets that can be focused on the risk and compliancy side of things. One of the ways that we can do that is with a risk registry. So, what we would be able to leverage there is putting together a centralized list of the different risks to track, the different tasks we have at hand relative to those risks, and being able to measure the residual risks compared to the inherent risks after remediation of those risks. Another piece to this could be vendor risk. We have a lot of different vendors we might have at play that we communicate with or have a relationship with. So we need to understand what risk we're under vis-a-vis those vendor relationships. So this can be a special category of risk management. Vendors have to be categorized based on the type of data they have access to, the level of dependency on that vendor, and the difficulty of replacing that vendor. And vendor risk assessment is typically done using questionnaires with attestations working as proxies, such as a SOC 2 report. And it's very important to reassess your vendors periodically based upon the different risk level that they present to you or the business. Next piece on this would be incident management. Risk management is about risk reduction to acceptable levels, like we spoke about, not so much risk elimination. Issues will happen. And incident management is the process that defines how the problem is managed by your organization. So you have to have your incidents detected, analyzed, contained, eradicated, recovered, and have notes on post event activities so that you can look at your own incidents and learn a lesson from them. And another piece of this, of course, is the BCPDR side of things. Incidents might trigger your different BCDR plans that you have in place. And every business needs to have a very solid BCDR plan in place because the focus from those is on recovery. But keep in mind, recovery might not necessarily be to the original location. So we have to make sure we have our plan laid out structurally and easily accessible to the rest of the team. On the whole, we just want to be sure that we've got mechanisms and structures in place to make tracking and responding to that risk a lot easier. Next, we're going to speak on compliance. Short and sweet on this, compliance is about meeting certain regulatory standards to verify that we can effectively handle data or securely store that data. And in the modern day, compliance has grown into an enormously wide field, and it's always growing because more businesses means more people needing to be compliant. Now, whether you need to comply with the different laws like, HIPAA compliance, high tech compliance, GLBA, the New York Shield Act, or, just your local state data breach laws, or you might even need to comply with different things like the HIPAA security rule, PCI DSS compliances, NCUAs or FDIC compliancy rules. And there's also a lot of different regulations that you might need to adhere to as well, like NIST 853, ISO 27001, ITIL standards. There's a lot that can go into this. So there's a lot of different compliances you might need to adhere to depending on the kind of business that you're doing. And though we've spoken about what compliance is, we also want to speak about what compliance is not. First and foremost, compliance is not optional. Your business, if it has any plans to grow and scale into the future, needs to adhere to these different compliancy standards so that you can be sure you've equipped and that you are equipped to do business at the level you desire to. And compliance also isn't a one and done sort of deal. It's a constant process of maintaining and updating your internal processes, policies, and controls so that you're always able to maintain compliancy and keep doing business effectively. And further than that, compliance itself is not security. There are plenty of companies out there with the controls in place to achieve compliancy, but still have no security standards in place internally to properly leverage that compliance. And further than that, if you're a company that is compliant but not secure, your score can go up significantly as a result of that. And at the end of the day, we know that a company must be both compliant and secure, as you can see right here. Now, let's talk about how we can manage these compliance requirements. The first piece to this is going to be, again, your policies and the corporate policies you have at play. Your policies are the documentation of your corporate direction, like I mentioned. So we have to make sure that we have a password management policy in place, a backup policy in place, structure around these policies so that we know how to react and we aren't at risk of losing business continuity as a result of these sorts of actions. And we've got a risk management strategy in play. And inside of IT Glue, like I mentioned to you, you're going to have a centralized space for all those policies to exist, as well as versioning and an immutable audit trail. So you can always be sure that they're accessible, up to date, and verifiable. And the same way that we spoke earlier about policies, the same thing about policy exceptions would also apply here. Because, like I said then, rules are important, but sometimes those exceptions are needed, and you always have to document those, approve those, and review those periodically. And just like I mentioned with the policies themselves and centralizing those into IT Glue, we can also centralize your policy exceptions because in the same place that you would want to see all your policies, you would ideally want to know all the exceptions to those policies. And just as with governance, we'll need evidence or auditing capabilities to be sure that we can audit these exceptions and compliance requirements within our own documentation. Further on the policies and procedures, we have to consider how we structure that for ourselves. What information are we documenting on our procedures? Does it all need to exist in one document, or does it need to be split out into multiple, more robust documentation pieces? And when we tie it to our compliance, we need to document specific information about these policies and procedures, such as the purpose of these policies, what's the real scope of what it affects, what are the key definitions needed to understand the impact, and who's responsible for ensuring this procedure or policy is properly followed? The biggest rule is we want to have a verifiable way to say that we'll do what we say that we're going to do. And on the whole, compliance cannot be achieved without documentation. There are many certifications, frameworks, and audits that exist in the global market right now that are being applied through MSPs. Documentation will be a barrier to meeting those objectives. And there's more and more evidence that if you want to be a compliance service manager, documentation is a linchpin to achieving that outcome. And when it comes to GRC, IT Glue is equipped with a litany of features that really help you achieve a better GRC status, whether that be automations for discovering your network and asset information, to checklists for setting some standards in place for your procedures, to transparent ways to communicate data back and forth with your clients, or even automated workflows to keep the right stakeholders in the loop. IT Glue is able to set you up for success. And speaking on automation for a moment, we really want to make sure that we can mitigate manual work where we can, especially where documentation is concerned, as it's always dynamic and changing. A lot of times people don't think too much about documentation until they have to, doing a post-mortem on an incident response or in preparation for an audit, for example. So we want to automate as much of your documentation as possible. This proactive approach means less work for you guys down the road, and it also means that you can extract more value from your documentation today. And like I mentioned, you can document checklists and procedures. You can keep these things in the same place as all of your assets, user, and vendor documentation. And you can also link them to relevant assets and passwords so that everything you need is easy to access. When you're looking up a problem asset, attached to that record should be that asset's password, SOPs for different issues, checklists on how to handle that, as well as our compliancy information tied directly to that, all in one single centralized place so that you can effectively solve problems and make sure that all of your assets are adhering to the compliance standards that you and the business are trying to follow for yourselves. And transparency is huge when we speak about GRC. If you've ever struggled trying to justify something to senior management, you'll know that there's a lot of times when their knowledge of IT is kind of like a black hole. The thing that makes life easier for IT is being able to showcase that transparency. And one of the neat things you can do with a good system for documentation is share the correct information with the correct people, as well being able to do that securely, which again, focused on adhering to those compliancy standards and making sure that you're not transmitting data in a risky format or in a risky way. That way, you will be able to work with IT Glue to accomplish that. And one other way that your documentation can serve you is through workflows. Like I mentioned, you can really set in place some standards for how it is that you're working with your information, but we have to make sure that everyone is equally informed on that information as well. So you can build out data flows inside of IT Glue to really let you know when certain actions or certain things are happening within your documentation, and you guys can be proactive about mitigating those changes from there or being proactive about reacting to those changes as they need to happen. Now, before I conclude on things, I just want to be sure that everyone knows about our ongoing show specials. If you follow the link currently up on the screen, you'll be taken to a sign up page to receive further information on the IT Glue platform. And with our show special, you can save 20% on your first 5 seats with us. And if you look into our add on applications for further automations, you can even increase those savings up to 30% off for signing up with IT. So, once again, thank you everyone so much for your time today. And we hope to hear from all of you soon so we can show you even more about how IT Glue can fit into the future of your business relative to your risk and compliancy. So, thank you all for your time and have a good rest of your day.